The sun. It's 93 million miles away. It's round and bright and hot. It's nice. Orbiting a star such as the sun confers many benefits, such as being able to see good in the daytime and knowing what year it is. But what if we angered the sun and it decided to destroy us all? Hi there, boys and girls, it's Chris with Deep Dive Books, the show where a librarian talks about books. We're going to examine that very question today when we bask in the apocalyptic glow of Solar Flare by Larry Burkett. A little background, I cut my teeth on Christian thrillers as a kid. It started with Left Behind, the insane 16-book saga dramatizing the events of the Book of Revelation. If you were any kind of a reader growing up in a Christian household in the 1990s, you read Left Behind and actually thought it was good. It wasn't. The people in those books were always using cellular phones and electronic mail, stockpiling weapons and outmaneuvering the servants of Satan through the power of prayer and superior laptops. But, like that one song says, they don't write them like that anymore. Nowadays, you ask for Christian fiction that'll put hair on your chest. All you're gonna get is a cornucopia of Amish romances. Look at this one, A Plain Man. I tried reading this and gave up halfway. It was about a man doing roofing work and eating bagged lunches. Man, if I want somebody to build me a nice barn, I'll get in touch with the Amish. But when I want Christian fiction that'll get my blood boiling, I expect novels like Solar Flare. This is one of those books where it's almost impossible to separate the author from the story. Here's Larry Burkett standing in a field circa 1997, wearing a red cap. All you need to know about this guy is that he would have been absolutely over the moon if he had lived to see 2016. Sadly, he passed away in 2003. Dr. Jason Hobart is an astronomy professor at Rockford College in Illinois. A few years back, he made headlines when he predicted a massive solar flare that could disrupt communications on Earth. His prediction came true, sort of. After a pretty big solar eruption, the northern lights flared up for a few days. Hobart predicted it would get way worse, leading to worldwide chaos. That didn't happen, and he became the laughingstock of the nation. I don't think that would really happen. If a scientist predicted a doomsday solar flare today, the story would probably be something you scroll past on Facebook without even reading the comment section. But thanks in large part to the liberal media, Hobart becomes an object of scorn among both the staff and students at Rockford College, despite still being kind of an expert on the sun. Unfortunately, trouble is brewing on the sun. From his backyard observatory, Jason Hobart discovers that Area 403, a volatile patch on the face of the sun, is ready to pop like a zit and flood the Earth with hot, steaming coronal mass. And it's not your average, everyday solar flare either. This is the big one. After his past humiliation, Hobart is feeling pretty gun-shy about reporting this. But if he stays mum, the world could be doomed. What a dilemma! One day in the faculty room, a jerk colleague of Jason overhears him talking about the impending solar flare. Sensing an opportunity to humiliate Hobart, the guy leaks the story to WNN. It's really the leftist media outlet CNN. Did you catch that? Now, you might not think that a national network would consider faculty room gossip newsworthy, but they rush a reporter out to Rockford College right away to interview Hobart. While they're grilling him about the solar flare, they slip in a question about an asteroid that's going to have a near miss with planet Earth. Should the president try to destroy the asteroid with nuclear missiles? Hobart says no. Well, it turns out that's what the Republican president says too. Lobbing nukes at an asteroid that is going to miss Earth anyway is wasteful and dangerous. WNN seizes the opportunity to discredit the president by linking him with Hobart, who even years later is still the butt of jokes across the nation. Speaking of butts, we spend a lot of time in this book listening to President Philip Houston arguing with his advisors. There's Press Secretary Alan Dean, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Floyd Boland, and White House Chief of Staff Warren Butts. Maybe it's childish of me to bring this up, but why would you purposely name one of your characters Butts? Some people are born into that unfortunate name in real life and manage to carry it with dignity. But when you're an author and can name your characters anything you want, why would you settle on Butts? It just sets you up for unintentional laughs. There's this one part when Warren Butts tries to contradict the president, and the president says, "No buts, Warren." Oh, and we also get to meet the president's head Secret Service agent, a huge man named Cece. Well, when a minor solar flare does strike the Earth, causing some power outages and communication problems, the president decides to send for Hobart and see what he has to say. Hobart goes to the White House and basically gives a TED Talk on solar flares. He tells the president that the worst flares are yet to come and advises him to ground all aircraft and shut down all industry until they've passed. The president thinks Hobart may be onto something and decides to take his advice. But as we've recently learned, inconvenience in the name of public safety is intolerable to the American public, and President Houston's decision to shut some things down proves wildly unpopular. Wait, the president receives advance warning of a global catastrophe, heeds the advice of the scientific community, and privileges human life over economic output? Maybe this author wouldn't have been as ecstatic in 2016 as I thought. Well, anyway, the president and his men argue for about 100 pages over whether or not a world-ending solar flare is going to strike. There's a little one that causes some minor disruption. Is the danger past, or is the worst yet to come? Do we shut down the country or not? Sound familiar? Then the big one does hit. The Big Daddy, the mother of all flares. Not your grandfather's solar flare. A solar flare that'll make you slap your grandma. Everything Hobart predicted comes true. No power, no water, no food, no communications.
We got no food, we got no jobs, our pets' heads are falling off!
Some stuff works at night, but it's pretty bad. Pretty much the instant, and I mean the instant, the lights go out, it's looting and rioting like you can't imagine. But don't you worry, the president has it under control. He vows, "We're going to protect American citizens, and if it means armed confrontations with the gangs, so be it." You know, maybe Larry Burkett would have been excited for 2016 after all. General Boland is only too happy to carry out the trigger-happy president's orders. "Hot dog,"
he thought.
"This is the way an army should be run."
Boland's lifelong hero was General George Patton. His greatest regret in life was that he had missed all the big wars. Now he would have his chance, and he relished taking on the gangs. The liberal courts had prohibited any real punishment of these thugs, but now they would get their due, and he was just the guy to do it.
Boy, there's nothing more glorious than going to war with your own citizens. Burkett in this novel speaks of the gangs as this massive, cohesive force of unlimited malevolence that's going to massacre everything in sight the moment there's any problem with the power grid. In fact, it's a little disturbing that in this tale of disaster, where no antagonist beyond nature itself is required to drive the plot, Burkett chooses to make villains of the American people themselves. At least the lower income variety. I think history has shown us repeatedly that in the aftermath of a natural disaster, poor people are not the ones who exacerbate the suffering. The federal government, in all its incompetence, indifference, and corruption, seems to have a knack for taking a bad situation and turning it into a human tragedy and a national disgrace. I think it's safe to say that Burkett would disagree.
The rioting resulted in one positive aspect. The majority of honest citizens stayed home and bolted their doors. Those with weapons armed themselves, and those without prayed a lot. Many of the suburban neighborhoods were spared because most of the people living there were honest, hard-working people.
it gets worse.
Police officers trying to deal with the rioters and gangs in the cities adopted a shoot first and ask questions later policy. In areas where the military had already been mobilized, control was re-established quickly. There was no ACLU present, no federal courts to interfere, and no politicians vying for votes. Only the police and the soldiers, and when they saw someone in the streets carrying a weapon, they shot first and asked questions later, if possible. The complete tally of murdered and wounded American citizens that day would never be known.
Hot dog! Without any pesky laws or civil rights or rules of engagement, we'll be able to mow down civilians faster than ever. From now on, it's shoot first, ask questions later, if possible. Hey! Sir, is that a gun? I said, is that a gun? Sir, answer me, is that a... Oh, he's dead. And it wasn't a gun, it was a hot dog. Huh. It was determined that questioning the suspect was impossible due to my shooting him too many times. How many American lives will be lost today? Guess we'll never know. There's even a bizarre scene where we're introduced to a number of characters we never see again. They all live in the same apartment building, and the pageantry of arming themselves to the teeth comes across as this unsubtle slam on common sense gun control. There's one guy who brags about how he's going to fight off the gangs using a police-issue shotgun he bought from a gang member who stole it out of a cop car. Just trying to figure out in what universe that makes any sense at all. Anyway, the government begins evacuating people from the major cities and moving them to emergency camps across the country. There's a detail here when Burkett is describing the evacuation procedure that I really like.
It was decided that a more orderly evacuation system would be necessary. An alphabetical lottery was chosen. Numbers corresponding to letters in the alphabet were thrown into a container, and the area coordinators would randomly select 5 numbers. People whose last names began with the corresponding letters would be evacuated.
Okay, folks, listen up. Number 18 is being evacuated. Raise your hand if you're an 18. Come on now, 18. 18. Don't you people know what number your last name starts with? A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Look, it's simple. L, M, N. Just take the first letter of your last name and find it on this alphanumeric conversion chart. Come on, could we possibly make this any simpler for you guys? Yeah. Couldn't you have just put letters on the pieces of paper? Finally, the big flare arrives. Wait a minute. Didn't it already arrive? Didn't like 4 or 5 solar flares already arrive? You're telling me we're like halfway through this book and the big solar flare is just coming now? Okay, whatever. The American people begin learning subsistence farming techniques from the Amish, and then the big solar flare arrives. Again? How many world-ending solar flares are in this book? Well, anyway, it's really hard to grow food when you don't know anything about farming, so... And then the big solar flare arrives. Seriously? So anyway, like I was saying, and then the big solar flare arrives. No. I think that's it. Probably. So like I was saying, all these camps pop up across America and everybody starts farming. It's a pretty hardscrabble existence. The solution to pretty much every discipline problem is to throw people in the stocks and taunt them with the absence of lawyers. Camp New Holland, where Professor Hobart and his crew wind up, turns into a type of Amish theocracy.
It was clear that the pilgrims of the 20th century had no difficulty with the somewhat theistic form of government within their own community. Without interference from the federal court system and the ACLU, scripture noticeably adorned every building and every wall in the camp.
Okay, I guess. It's a unique situation, a total crisis, so if everyone's okay with it, sure, slap a few Bible verses on the wall. That doesn't seem too obtrusive.
The rules in the camp were fairly simple. No stealing, no lying, no violence, and for the unmarried couples, particularly the teenagers, no sex.
How in the world are they going to enforce that one? They can't possibly.
Rules that had been lost for generations were re-established. There were rules of courting that were strictly enforced. Boys and girls were not allowed to go out unescorted. Those who did spent time in the camp kitchen, washing dishes and mopping. Repeat offenders spent time in the stocks.
And everyone's okay with this? A couple of kids sneak off to make out and get thrown in the stocks for it? Does this apply to grown-ups as well?
A married man and woman were caught in adultery, so a meeting of the leadership was held and the couple was brought before them. It was the decision of the committee that both the man and woman should spend 1 full day in the stocks. After that, the incidence of infidelity dropped dramatically.
Yeah, but if the only reason people avoid wrongdoing is for fear of punishment, especially corporal punishment, have you really solved anything?
Of course, there was some grumbling and mumbling from some elements of the camp, particularly those who once had been of a more liberal persuasion, but the majority of the camp population agreed with the public punishment. It was clear that most people were sick and tired of the lack of responsibility on the part of their fellow Americans. And now that each person depended on the others for their very survival, community rights superseded personal rights.
Whoa! Okay.
We will not comply! We will not comply!
Community rights superseded personal rights. Sick and tired of the lack of responsibility, community rights superseded personal rights.
Wow, that statement on American conservatism did not age well. And what are the children doing when the adults are sweating in the fields and clapping each other in the stocks?
During the day, when the adults were working in the fields, the children were organized into study groups. Most of the people in the camps, being non-professional educators, relied upon common sense teaching. They went back to the basics, the ABCs of learning. Any child who claimed to have one of the so-called learning disabilities invented by liberals, such as dyslexia, was placed in the stocks and put on reduced rations.
Okay, I made up that last part, but you believed it, didn't you?
They concentrated on teaching the children to read and write, and to add and subtract, without the use of electronic calculators. With the calculators and computers gone, most of the youths in camp had to learn how to think on their own.
Yeah, reading, writing, math, all those things they don't teach in schools these days. I noticed Burkett specifically mentions electronic calculators. Does that mean abacuses were allowed? And I'd like to know what kind of computers Burkett thought kids were using in 1997 that did all the thinking for them. In 2020, I have access to a low-level artificial intelligence with voice recognition, and I still can't get her to think for me. Alexa, do my homework for me.
Don't cheat, but you can ask me questions if it will help.
No. Alexa, write my essay for me.
Here's something I found from WikiHow. If you need to write an essay...
I said write it for me! Sorry, I guess as an educator myself, that last part just kind of grinds my gears. Burkett sounds like the kind of disgruntled dinosaur who angrily posts his children's homework assignments to Facebook to shame their teachers, and his chief complaint is that they don't involve enough cursive writing. Well, after several months, the sun finally calms down a little, and Jason Hobart discovers that the electrical generators work again. He notifies the president immediately, and you're probably thinking that the president is ecstatic, right? Mr. President, did you know the power is back on?
Butts asked.
Yeah, the professor called and said it's okay to fire up the generators. Wow, we're back in civilization again,
Dean exclaimed.
Yes, unfortunately, with all of its assets and liabilities.
Houston sighed.
Ah, yes. Back to having food, medicine, communications, sanitation. The 19th century was so much better with its average life expectancy of 40 years. Well, since there's no putting the electricity genie back in the bottle, might as well make the best of the situation and focus on rebuilding, right? And not exactly. The first policy decision the president makes once the lights start coming back on is that the gangs need to be punished. He tells General Boland, I want you to begin working on a plan for holding the gangs accountable. I want everyone who was involved in gang activity during this crisis brought to justice. Yes, sir,
Boland said with the enthusiasm that he felt inside. He was anxious to get at the gangs.
A lot of them won't need trials,
he vowed.
No trials? Seriously? How does that work? Are they going to descend on the cities and shoot or incarcerate anyone who looks like they might be involved with a gang? How do you even identify a gang member? Do they wear certain colors of clothing or have, I don't know, certain skin colors? Well, either way, the whole bringing the gangs to justice thing is a bit premature. Jason ends up marrying this lady named Annette who's been helping him track the solar flares. Right in the middle of the ceremony, the gangs attack the camp. The gangs know they'd be toast in a pitched battle against the Marines, Secret Service, and Amish people guarding the camp, so they opt for kidnapping Hobart's daughter for ransom. Big mistake. Cece and Lighthorse put on their best commando outfits and chase after the gangs, bent on justice. Oh, who's Lighthorse, you ask? He's the super important character who isn't even introduced until page 393. Lighthorse grabs his compound bow and shoots some explosive arrows at the gang members, while Cece rams some guys off the road with his Hummer and beats the tar out of them. Well, after spending the winter in tents and living on rations, it turns out fully 95% of Americans say they would rather keep living in the camps than return to the cities. And that apparently is what they end up doing. I said this book was a Christian thriller, and it is, but it doesn't follow the conventions of Christian thriller writing laid out by the Left Behind series. You don't get marathon recitations of scripture or page after page of characters prostrating themselves in prayer. In fact, most of this book has hardly any religious bent to it at all. Most of the book consists of the author dunking on strawman liberals and Democrats. There's plenty of military hero worship and American patriotism, even when the country is exposed as a poverty-ridden hellscape teeming with violent criminals and unlicensed firearms. But Burkett's religious views play second fiddle to his Republican Party boosterism. It's not until near the end of the book when everybody suddenly starts praying and converting to Christianity en masse. Burkett's novel is not so much a tool of evangelism or apologetics as it is a thinly veiled Y2K fantasy. I was only a kid at the time, but it seemed in the late 90s that the catastrophic potential for the Y2K bug was endlessly intriguing to Christians. For one thing, the year 2000 seemed like a nice round number, perfect for the second coming of Christ.
Yeah, don't worry, guys. I'm sure we got it right this time.
Another sticking point was that the potential fallout of the Y2K bug seemed to set the stage for what many Christians saw as the fast-approaching end times. In the book, President Houston muses on a passage from the book of Revelation that describes a huge battle involving 200 million dudes on horseback. If the flares continue, there will be no jet airplanes or rockets. If a war broke out, it might well be fought on horseback again. It could be the exact scenario described in the book of Revelation. I don't think I imagined the low-key disappointment when the new millennium arrived with barely a hiccup, and everyone reluctantly pinned their end-of-the-world hopes on 2012. When I first read this book as a kid, I thought it was pretty good. But you know how when you're a kid, you're kind of dumb? Apart from everything we've just hashed out story-wise, the book is such an amateur production that it's impossible to take it seriously. It's one of those books that makes you wonder if there was any editorial oversight at all, or even a peer critique by a college freshman armed with a blue pencil and a copy of Strunk and White. Here are a few things off the top of my head that any editor worth his salt should have addressed before letting this go to press. Burkett is obsessed with the passive voice. It's okay to use the passive voice sometimes, really, it is. But he uses it so much and with so little awareness that it really makes you squirm. This book can't figure out if it takes place in the 20th century or the 21st. Seriously. It was written in 1997, that much we know, but throughout the story, Burkett refers to the present day as both the 20th century and the 21st. I honestly can't tell if he meant for this to be set in the near future of like 2003 and just kept confusing it with 1997, or if he was engaging in that habit that I think people had in the late 90s of anticipating the new millennium with such fervor that by 1997, 98, 99, we spoke as though the 21st century had already arrived. There are a lot of pointless asides and tangents in this book. There's a lengthy description at one point of a dream that Warren Butts is having where he's flying to Mars and thinks he's about to die because his spacecraft just depressurized. There's another scene that takes up half a page when Professor Hobart is wandering around the airport parking lot trying to find his car and then brainstorming little tricks he can use next time to remember where he parked. Near the end of the book, we also get the story behind CC's name. His mother named him after the first thing she saw when he was born. That happened to be a calendar, so he was named Calendar Collins. Burkett introduces a ton of characters in the middle of the novel that you never hear from again. When the big solar flare hits, you start reading about all these characters with first and last names and rudimentary backstories, people who either listen to the president's advice and evacuate the cities, or hole up in their homes and presumably get slaughtered by the gangs. Enough narrative focus is placed on these characters that you think they're going to have some part to play later on in the story, but in most cases you never hear from them again. Or you just find out that they got murdered. I think Burkett throws in these extra characters to try to illustrate the scale and the scope of the disaster, but it's handled pretty clumsily. Anyone reading Solar Flare today would get to the part about the gangs and leap at the chance to label the whole story and its author as racist. And they'd be correct, by today's definition. But even assuming Burkett isn't writing from a place of prejudice, when he writes dialogue for the gang members, his attempts at capturing urban vernacular are downright embarrassing. And this is where the book's lack of acknowledgements becomes especially glaring. It seems like massive acknowledgement sections are becoming more and more common. Many authors these days, whether they're writing fiction or nonfiction, whether they're writing for kids or adults, dedicate huge amounts of space to acknowledging all the experts and niche specialists who lent credibility and authenticity to their work, even for the tiniest details. Burkett, for the most part, seems to have written this novel off the top of his head, with little to no research or expert consultation. And strangely enough, this becomes most glaring not when he's talking about astronomy or government, but when he's trying to write diverse urban characters who sound like human beings. It's just this white grandpa's version of what poor people must sound like.
Let's see. Anytime they use a verb ending in ing, it's just gonna be in apostrophe. And anytime they say you, it's gonna be ya. And for some reason, whenever they say the number 100, it's gonna come out 100.
To be fair, Burkett does give a nod to a few people at the beginning of the book. I would like to thank my editor, Adeline Griffith. I don't think she even read the manuscript. Greg Thornton at Moody Press, and my faithful readers who allow me to do these fun things. Well, I guess that's it for Solar Flare by Larry Burkett. If you liked this video, please hit that like button, leave a comment, and be sure to subscribe to help the channel grow. We've sure had some fun bagging on this crazy novel that nobody remembers, but we should always keep in mind that a solar flare does pose a plausible threat to planet Earth. Why, at any moment there could be a massive solar eruption which would cause... Oh no. Oh no, it's happening. This is it. We gotta get ready. Never thought I'd actually have to use these. This is it. We have to defend the homeland against the gangs. If I don't make it back alive, God bless America.
Babe, sorry about that. I flipped the breaker. I was running the coffee maker and the microwave at the same time. Chris?